Now, vaccine passports have been introduced in Wales as of today. We'll discuss that in depth in a moment. Different forms of this COVID ID card have already been rolled out in Scotland, Canada, some areas of the US and several countries across Europe. Throughout this pandemic, Italy has deployed some of the most stringent lockdown and now vaccine passport measures of anywhere in Europe. And this week, protests in the nation's capital descended into riots. Let's take a look at some of what happened in Rome. This footage is taken from yesterday's protests in Rome against the Green Pass rollout. In Italy, huge numbers of protesters attended, most of whom were initially peaceful. Yet, as you can see here, scenes ultimately took an ugly turn, with trade union buildings being stormed. Prime Minister Mario Draghi's office was also targeted. Well, today, members of the Italian far right have been arrested by the Italian police after this violence. Numerous protests have taken place across Italy over the last few weeks as the newly introduced Green Pass system is being described as one of the most draconian in Europe. From this Friday, Italy is to make its vaccine passport compulsory for all workers, public and private sector, who will be subjected to heavy fines or suspension without pay if they fail to comply with new rules. Well, after those scenes, we're joined now by Conservative journalist Gabe Kaminksy, who is in Italy and has been on the ground during some of these protests. Welcome to the programme. Gabe, can you just tell us, first of all, give us a feeling of what it was like on the ground? Initially, these protests were peaceful, and then as some of the more peaceful people went away, it turned really rather ugly.
Yeah, that's right. So I was not on the ground in Rome, actually, but I was in the ground in Florence. And the protests in Florence were actually not violent in any capacity. The people were going through the streets simply chanting liberty, freedom, anti-Green Pass sentiment, people who really are just uncomfortable with the government overstepping in this way, this sort of very overbearing sentiment. In terms of Rome, that is correct. The protest did turn violent, which is very unfortunate. But I think, look, it certainly speaks to the energy where the Italian people are very dissatisfied and very unhappy with a government that is not really recognizing any autonomy of the individual citizen.
This isn't the first time that we've seen big violent protests in Italy. Is this just something that the Italians do more than potentially the United Kingdom, or is this something new? Is this something different?
Well, so we have seen this prior. We've seen in Italy prior people burning their green passes in the streets. There obviously has been rioting, which, in any situation, it's not a good thing to see people rioting. But in general, this is something we are seeing, of course, across the world right now, but especially in Italy right now, where you have this very draconian policy where workers have to get a green pass, so they have to be vaccinated effectively, or they risk being suspended and fined, which in my eyes is basically the same thing as being fired.
Yeah, it does seem that this Green Pass system in Italy is pretty different from other Green Pass systems, or at least vaccine passport systems elsewhere in the world. Why is it that Italy have taken a more draconian approach? Why is it that public and private sector workers will be forced to show these ID cards, whereas in other countries there have been arguably more liberal interpretations of what it means to have a vaccine passport?
Yeah, that's right. So, even in the United States right now, you had the Biden administration previously put forth a mandate for the private sector. That mandate has not really been adhered to by OSHA, who is actually supposed to be carrying out that mandate. What we've seen in Italy, different from other places in the EU necessarily, is this very sharp turn towards very authoritarian, it very much feels like, where you have a government that is not really acknowledging the rights of the private citizen, whereas it literally says in the Italian constitution, verbatim, I'm pretty sure, that you have a right to work. Well, if you have a right to work, how can you have a right to work if you're required to be vaccinated? And if you're not vaccinated, then you don't have a right to work. So it certainly feels very overbearing. And I think, look, people are very unhappy here. And I sense there's a lot of energy in the coming weeks. And look, a lot of protests have been continued to be planned, and for good reason, honestly.
Now, I suppose that leaders like Draghi in Italy and potentially others will have looked to France, where there was some unrest before Macron introduced these vaccine passports. But actually in France, it looks like it's turned into a bit of a success for Emmanuel Macron. Vaccination rates are way up. There's less disturbance than there was, at least initially, and people seem to be getting on with their lives. Is that a point of view that you can sort of see happening? Maybe these other leaders are looking to see sort of what has been hailed as a bit of a success for Emmanuel Macron, actually, and wanting some of that for themselves.
In terms of vaccination rates increasing, do you mean?
Yeah, in terms of vaccination rates increasing, but also the sort of initial shock to the system dying away pretty quickly. The riots that we're so used to seeing in Paris so often now sort of don't seem to be sustaining. And Macron was hailed by many publications in many parts of the world as having swung a bit of a success when many people thought it may well have been a policy failure initially.
Yeah, right. I see even if vaccination rates are increasing, even if perhaps less people are getting the coronavirus in a given country, I think it's still, look, from my point of view, I find it entirely reasonable for people in Italy to be uncomfortable by such mandates because it's just not recognizing their individual rights. I mean, it seems entirely unreasonable, I would say, for people to have to go to a restaurant, to go to a bar, starting out, of course, and for them to have to show private medical information to some bouncer or some guy lighting the door. It's like, what does that guy have any right to see my private medical information? And then, of course, you have the worker side, which is why these people are rebelling in the second place, which is saying, I have to do this because I am a worker in this country. So it's sort of, I don't think it's reasonable to say, well, vaccination rates are increasing, we should stop. Look, it's people's choice if they're going to get the vaccine. It's a very personal decision.
Now, just looking at Italian politics for a little while, I was looking up how many living former Italian prime ministers there are, and it's just about more than most other reasonably developed countries in the world. It seems like Italy cycles through a new prime minister every couple of years. Incredibly fractious politics, new parties bouncing up and down in the polls, old parties being displaced. What's the sense of the political world in Italy right now, and how moves like this may influence the next election?
Look, this could have a very significant impact in the next election. Like you said, Italy is constantly in flux. It's a country with many different factions. It's very much more convoluted than American politics, where I'm from, where there's the Democrats, there's the Republicans, there's perhaps libertarians, there's the Green Party. Here there's a number of parties. It's very complicated, but I think like we saw in the past several years, there has been a change in Italy with very much a transformation. You had the rise of someone like Matteo Salvini, sort of on the more populist right. And then we've had this sort of shift, I think, in another direction. And perhaps this vaccine conundrum could spawn another movement. It just depends. Will it be as simple as right-left? Or I think this is something where it is a little unifying. I mean, I know individuals certainly who I would say are on the left or moderate left who are not comfortable with this sort of overbearing government overreach.
Very interesting how things like this can really upset a very, very fragile political situation in Italy. It's something that I know many viewers of GBNews will like to keep a close eye on as it develops. Well, Gabe Kaminksy, thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing this afternoon.